The new god of invincibility. The new gods of invincibility. The new god of invincibility. The new goddess of invincibility. The new goddesses of invincibility. The new goddess of invincibility. The old god of invincibility. The old gods of invincibility. The old god of invincibility. The old goddess of invincibility. The old goddesses of invincibility. The old goddess of invincibility. The greater god of invincibility. The greater gods of invincibility. The greater god of invincibility. The greater goddess of invincibility. The greater goddesses of invincibility. The greater goddess of invincibility. The lesser god of invincibility. The lesser gods of invincibility. The lesser god of invincibility. The lesser goddess of invincibility. The lesser goddesses of invincibility. The lesser goddess of invincibility. The higher god of invincibility. The higher gods of invincibility. The higher god of invincibility. The higher goddess of invincibility. The higher goddesses of invincibility. The higher goddess of invincibility. The lower god of invincibility. The lower gods of invincibility. The lower god of invincibility. The lower goddess of invincibility. The lower goddesses of invincibility. The lower goddess of invincibility. The greater spirit of invincibility. The greater spirits of invincibility. The greater spirit of invincibility. The lesser spirit of invincibility. The lesser spirits of invincibility. The lesser spirit of invincibility. The higher spirit of invincibility. The higher spirits of invincibility. The higher spirit of invincibility. The lower spirit of invincibility. The lower spirits of invincibility. The lower spirit of invincibility. The major god of invincibility. The major gods of invincibility. The major god of invincibility. The major goddess of invincibility. The major goddesses of invincibility. The major goddess of invincibility. The minor god of invincibility. The minor gods of invincibility. The minor god of invincibility. The minor goddess of invincibility. The minor goddesses of invincibility. The minor goddess of invincibility. The superior god of invincibility. The superior gods of invincibility. The superior god of invincibility. The superior goddess of invincibility. The superior goddesses of invincibility. The superior goddess of invincibility. The inferior god of invincibility. The inferior gods of invincibility. The inferior god of invincibility. The inferior goddess of invincibility. The inferior goddesses of invincibility. The inferior goddess of invincibility. The ancestor god of invincibility. The ancestor gods of invincibility. The ancestor god of invincibility. The ancestor goddess of invincibility. The ancestor goddesses of invincibility. The ancestor goddess of invincibility. The ascendant god of invincibility. The ascendant gods of invincibility. The ascendant god of invincibility. The ascendant goddess of invincibility. The ascendant goddesses of invincibility. The ascendant goddess of invincibility. The descendant god of invincibility. The descendant gods of invincibility. The descendant god of invincibility. The descendant goddess of invincibility. The descendant goddesses of invincibility. The descendant goddess of invincibility. The transcendent god of invincibility. The transcendent gods of invincibility. The transcendent god of invincibility. The transcendent goddess of invincibility. The transcendent goddesses of invincibility. The transcendent goddess of invincibility. The past god of invincibility. The past gods of invincibility. The past god of invincibility. The past goddess of invincibility. The past goddesses of invincibility. The past goddess of invincibility. The present god of invincibility. The present gods of invincibility. The present god of invincibility. The present goddess of invincibility. The present goddesses of invincibility. The present goddess of invincibility. The future god of invincibility. The future gods of invincibility. The future god of invincibility. The future goddess of invincibility. The future goddesses of invincibility. The future goddess of invincibility. The authentic god of invincibility. The authentic gods of invincibility. The authentic god of invincibility. The authentic goddess of invincibility. The authentic goddesses of invincibility. The authentic goddess of invincibility. The synthetic god of invincibility. The synthetic gods of invincibility. The synthetic god of invincibility. The synthetic goddess of invincibility. The synthetic goddesses of invincibility. The synthetic goddess of invincibility. The progressive god of invincibility. The progressive gods of invincibility. The progressive god of invincibility. The progressive goddess of invincibility. The progressive goddesses of invincibility. The progressive goddess of invincibility. The regressive god of invincibility. The regressive gods of invincibility. The regressive god of invincibility. The regressive goddess of invincibility. The regressive goddesses of invincibility. The regressive goddess of invincibility. The ordinary god of invincibility. The ordinary gods of invincibility. The ordinary god of invincibility. The ordinary goddess of invincibility. The ordinary goddesses of invincibility. The ordinary goddess of invincibility. The extraordinary god of invincibility. The extraordinary gods of invincibility. The extraordinary god of invincibility. The extraordinary goddess of invincibility. The extraordinary goddesses of invincibility. The extraordinary goddess of invincibility. The static god of invincibility. The static gods of invincibility. The static god of invincibility. The static goddess of invincibility. The static goddesses of invincibility. The static goddess of invincibility. The dynamic god of invincibility. The dynamic gods of invincibility. The dynamic god of invincibility. The dynamic goddess of invincibility. The dynamic goddesses of invincibility. The dynamic goddess of invincibility. The land god of invincibility. The land gods of invincibility. The land god of invincibility. The land goddess of invincibility. The land goddesses of invincibility. The land goddess of invincibility. The sea god of invincibility. The sea gods of invincibility. The sea god of invincibility. The sea goddess of invincibility. The sea goddesses of invincibility. The sea goddess of invincibility. The sky god of invincibility. The sky gods of invincibility. The sky god of invincibility. The sky goddess of invincibility. The sky goddesses of invincibility. The sky goddess of invincibility. The god of invincibility. The gods of invincibility. The god of invincibility. The goddess of invincibility. The goddesses of invincibility. The goddess of invincibility. The half god of invincibility. The half gods of invincibility. The half god of invincibility. The half goddess of invincibility. The half goddesses of invincibility. The half goddess of invincibility. The vessel of invincibility. The vessels of invincibility. The vessel of invincibility. The name of invincibility. The names of invincibility. The name of invincibility. The person of invincibility. The persons of invincibility. The person of invincibility. The persona of invincibility. The personas of invincibility. The persona of invincibility. The personage of invincibility. The personages of invincibility. The personage of invincibility. The personality of invincibility. The personalities of invincibility. The personality of invincibility. The personification of invincibility. The personifications of invincibility. The personification of invincibility. The image of invincibility. The images of invincibility. The image of invincibility. The imagination of invincibility. The imaginations of invincibility. The imagination of invincibility. The belief of invincibility. The beliefs of invincibility. The belief of invincibility. The thought of invincibility. The thoughts of invincibility. The thought of invincibility. The word of invincibility. The words of invincibility. The word of invincibility. The action of invincibility. The actions of invincibility. The action of invincibility. The reaction of invincibility. The reactions of invincibility. The reaction of invincibility. The feeling of invincibility. The feelings of invincibility. The feeling of invincibility. The situation of invincibility. The situations of invincibility. The situation of invincibility. The circumstance of invincibility. The circumstances of invincibility. The circumstance of invincibility. The environment of invincibility. The environments of invincibility. The environment of invincibility. The relationship of invincibility. The relationships of invincibility. The relationship of invincibility. The number of invincibility. The numbers of invincibility. The number of invincibility. The formula of invincibility. The formulas of invincibility. The formula of invincibility. The equation of invincibility. The equations of invincibility. The equation of invincibility. The theory of invincibility. The theories of invincibility. The theory of invincibility. The symbol of invincibility. The symbols of invincibility. The symbol of invincibility. The color of invincibility. The colors of invincibility. The color of invincibility. The thing of invincibility. The things of invincibility. The thing of invincibility. The way of invincibility. The ways of invincibility. The way of invincibility. The place of invincibility. The places of invincibility. The place of invincibility. The time of invincibility. The times of invincibility. The time of invincibility. The event of invincibility. The events of invincibility. The event of invincibility. The result of invincibility. The results of invincibility. The result of invincibility. The crown of invincibility. The crowns of invincibility. The crown of invincibility. The throne of invincibility. The thrones of invincibility. The throne of invincibility. The invincibility king. The invincibility kings. The invincibility kingdom. The invincibility kingdoms. The invincibility king's subject. The invincibility king's subjects. The invincibility king's dominion. The invincibility king's dominions. The kingdom of invincibility. The kingdoms of invincibility. The kingdom of invincibility. The invincibility queen. The invincibility queens. The invincibility queendom. The invincibility queendoms. The invincibility queen's subject. The invincibility queen's subjects. The invincibility queen's dominion. The invincibility queen's dominions. The queendom of invincibility. The queendoms of invincibility. The queendom of invincibility. The invincibility prince. The invincibility princes. The invincibility princedom. The invincibility princedoms. The invincibility prince's subject. The invincibility prince's subjects. The invincibility prince's dominion. The invincibility prince's dominions. The princedom of invincibility. The princedoms of invincibility. The princedom of invincibility. The invincibility princess. The invincibility princesses. The invincibility princessdom. The invincibility princessdoms. The invincibility princess's subject. The invincibility princess's subjects. The invincibility princess's dominion. The invincibility princess's dominions. The princessdom of invincibility. The princessdoms of invincibility. The princessdom of invincibility. The lord of invincibility. The lords of invincibility. The lord of invincibility. The lordess of invincibility. The lordesses of invincibility. The lordess of invincibility. The priest of invincibility. The priests of invincibility. The priest of invincibility. The priestess of invincibility. The priestesses of invincibility. The priestess of invincibility. The ritual of invincibility. The rituals of invincibility. The ritual of invincibility. The shrine of invincibility. The shrines of invincibility. The shrine of invincibility. The temple of invincibility. The temples of invincibility. The temple of invincibility. The leader of invincibility. The leaders of invincibility. The leader of invincibility. The follower of invincibility. The followers of invincibility. The follower of invincibility. The natural substance of invincibility. The natural substances of invincibility. The natural substance of invincibility. The supernatural substance of invincibility. The supernatural substances of invincibility. The supernatural substance of invincibility. The temporal substance of invincibility. The temporal substances of invincibility. The temporal substance of invincibility. The spiritual substance of invincibility. The spiritual substances of invincibility. The spiritual substance of invincibility. The natural form of invincibility. The natural forms of invincibility. The natural form of invincibility. The supernatural form of invincibility. The supernatural forms of invincibility. The supernatural form of invincibility. The temporal form of invincibility. The temporal forms of invincibility. The temporal form of invincibility. The spiritual form of invincibility. The spiritual forms of invincibility. The spiritual form of invincibility. The age of invincibility. The ages of invincibility. The age of invincibility. The era of invincibility. The heiress of invincibility. The era of invincibility. The awakener of invincibility. The awakeners of invincibility. The awakener of invincibility. The awakening of invincibility. The awakenings of invincibility. The awakening of invincibility. The realm of invincibility. The realms of invincibility. The realm of invincibility. The dimension of invincibility. The dimensions of invincibility. The dimension of invincibility. The zone of invincibility. The zones of invincibility. The zone of invincibility. The frequency of invincibility. The frequencies of invincibility. The frequency of invincibility. The century of invincibility. The centuries of invincibility. The century of invincibility. The millennium of invincibility. The millenniums of invincibility. The millennium of invincibility. The purpose of invincibility. The purposes of invincibility. The purpose of invincibility. The meaning of invincibility. The meanings of invincibility. The meaning of invincibility. The culture of invincibility. The cultures of invincibility. The culture of invincibility. The demonstrator of invincibility. The demonstrators of invincibility. The demonstrator of invincibility. The demonstration of invincibility. The demonstrations of invincibility. The demonstration of invincibility. The manifester of invincibility. The manifestors of invincibility. The manifester of invincibility. The manifestation of invincibility. The manifestations of invincibility. The manifestation of invincibility. The presence of invincibility. The presences of invincibility. The presence of invincibility. The glow of invincibility. The glows of invincibility. The glow of invincibility. The goal of invincibility. The goals of invincibility. The goal of invincibility. The plan of invincibility. The plans of invincibility. The plan of invincibility. The book of invincibility. The books of invincibility. The book of invincibility. The philosopher of invincibility. The philosophers of invincibility. The philosopher of invincibility. The philosophy of invincibility. The philosophies of invincibility. The philosophy of invincibility. The releaser of invincibility. The releasers of invincibility. The releaser of invincibility. The release of invincibility. The releases of invincibility. The release of invincibility. The variable of invincibility. The variables of invincibility. The variable of invincibility. The cause of invincibility. The causes of invincibility. The cause of invincibility. The effect of invincibility. The effects of invincibility. The effect of invincibility. The journey of invincibility. The journeys of invincibility. The journey of invincibility. The emergence of invincibility. The emergences of invincibility. The emergence of invincibility. The source of invincibility. The sources of invincibility. The source of invincibility. The originator of invincibility. The originators of invincibility. The originator of invincibility. The origin of invincibility. The origins of invincibility. The origin of invincibility. The forefather of invincibility. The forefathers of invincibility. The forefather of invincibility. The foremother of invincibility. The foremothers of invincibility. The foremother of invincibility. The ancestor of invincibility. The ancestors of invincibility. The ancestor of invincibility. The descendant of invincibility. The descendants of invincibility. The descendant of invincibility. The lineage of invincibility. The lineages of invincibility. The lineage of invincibility. The heritage of invincibility. The heritages of invincibility. The heritage of invincibility. The heir of invincibility. The heirs of invincibility. The heir of invincibility. The co-heir of invincibility. The co-heirs of invincibility. The co-heir of invincibility. The joint heir of invincibility. The joint heirs of invincibility. The joint heir of invincibility. The dynasty of invincibility. The dynasties of invincibility. The dynasty of invincibility. The force of invincibility. The forces of invincibility. The force of invincibility. The law of invincibility. The laws of invincibility. The law of invincibility. The pact of invincibility. The pacts of invincibility. The Pact of Invincibility, the Game of Invincibility. The Games of Invincibility. The Game of Invincibility, the Mask of Invincibility. The Masks of Invincibility. The Mask of Invincibility, the Armor of Invincibility. The Armors of Invincibility. The Armor of Invincibility, the Sword of Invincibility. The Swords of Invincibility. The Sword of Invincibility, the Shield of Invincibility. The Shields of Invincibility. The Shield of Invincibility, the Force Shield of Invincibility. The Force Shields of Invincibility. The Force Shield of Invincibility, the Armored Force Shield of Invincibility. The Armored Force Shields of Invincibility. The Armored Force Shield of Invincibility, the Champion of Invincibility. The Champions of Invincibility. The Champion of Invincibility, the Guardian of Invincibility. The Guardians of Invincibility. The Guardian of Invincibility, the Defender of Invincibility. The Defenders of Invincibility. The Defender of Invincibility, the Protector of Invincibility. The Protectors of Invincibility. The Protector of Invincibility, the Chant of Invincibility. The Chants of Invincibility. The Chant of Invincibility, the Shape of Invincibility. The Shapes of Invincibility. The Shape of Invincibility, the Cube of Invincibility. The Cubes of Invincibility. The Cube of Invincibility, the Cuboid of Invincibility. The Cuboids of Invincibility. The Cuboid of Invincibility, the Sphere of Invincibility. The Spheres of Invincibility. The Sphere of Invincibility, the Spheroid of Invincibility. The Spheroids of Invincibility. The Spheroid of Invincibility, the Prism of Invincibility. The Prisms of Invincibility. The Prism of Invincibility, the Pyramid of Invincibility. The Pyramids of Invincibility. The Pyramid of Invincibility, the Cylinder of Invincibility. The Cylinders of Invincibility. The Cylinder of Invincibility, the Cone of Invincibility. The Cones of Invincibility. The Cone of Invincibility, the Triangle of Invincibility. The Triangles of Invincibility. The Triangle of Invincibility, the Circle of Invincibility. The Circles of Invincibility. The Circle of Invincibility, the Semicircle of Invincibility. The Semicircles of Invincibility. The Semicircle of Invincibility, the Square of Invincibility. The Squares of Invincibility. The Square of Invincibility, the Rectangle of Invincibility. The Rectangles of Invincibility. The Rectangle of Invincibility, the Parallelogram of Invincibility. The Parallelograms of Invincibility. The Parallelogram of Invincibility, the Rhombus of Invincibility. The Rhombuses of Invincibility. The Rhombus of Invincibility, the Trapezoid of Invincibility. The Trapezoids of Invincibility. The Trapezoid of Invincibility, the Polygon of Invincibility. The Polygons of Invincibility. The Polygon of Invincibility, the Pentagon of Invincibility. The Pentagons of Invincibility. The Pentagon of Invincibility, the Hexagon of Invincibility. The Hexagons of Invincibility. The Hexagon of Invincibility, the Septagon of Invincibility. The Septagons of Invincibility. The Septagon of Invincibility, the Octagon of Invincibility. The Octagons of Invincibility. The Octagon of Invincibility, the Nonagon of Invincibility. The Nonagons of Invincibility. The Nonagon of Invincibility, the Decagon of Invincibility. The Decagons of Invincibility. The Decagon of Invincibility, the Evolution of Invincibility. The Evolutions of Invincibility. The Evolution of Invincibility, the Revolution of Invincibility. The Revolutions of Invincibility. The Revolution of Invincibility, the Elemental Art of Invincibility. The Elemental Arts of Invincibility. The Elemental Art of Invincibility, the Elemental Science of Invincibility. The Elemental Sciences of Invincibility. The Elemental Science of Invincibility, the Elemental Principle of Invincibility. The Elemental Principles of Invincibility. The Elemental Principle of Invincibility, the Elemental Technology of Invincibility. The Elemental Technologies of Invincibility. The Elemental Technology of Invincibility, the Low Elemental Art of Invincibility. The Low Elemental Arts of Invincibility. The Low Elemental Art of Invincibility, the Low Elemental Science of Invincibility. The Low Elemental Sciences of Invincibility. The Low Elemental Science of Invincibility, the Low Elemental Principle of Invincibility. The low elemental principles of invincibility. The low elemental principle of invincibility. The low elemental technology of invincibility. The low elemental technologies of invincibility. The low elemental technology of invincibility. The high elemental art of invincibility. The high elemental arts of invincibility. The high elemental art of invincibility. The high elemental science of invincibility. The high elemental sciences of invincibility. The high elemental science of invincibility. The high elemental principle of invincibility. The high elemental principles of invincibility. The high elemental principle of invincibility. The high elemental technology of invincibility. The high elemental technologies of invincibility. The high elemental technology of invincibility. The agent of invincibility. The agents of invincibility. The agent of invincibility. The agency of invincibility. The agencies of invincibility. The agency of invincibility. The amplifier of invincibility. The amplifiers of invincibility. The amplifier of invincibility. The amplification of invincibility. The amplifications of invincibility. The amplification of invincibility. The enhancer of invincibility. The enhancers of invincibility. The enhancer of invincibility. The enhancement of invincibility. The enhancements of invincibility. The enhancement of invincibility. The magnifier of invincibility. The magnifiers of invincibility. The magnifier of invincibility. The magnification of invincibility. The magnifications of invincibility. The magnification of invincibility. The influencer of invincibility. The influencers of invincibility. The influencer of invincibility. The influence of invincibility. The influences of invincibility. The influence of invincibility. The emanator of invincibility. The emanators of invincibility. The emanator of invincibility. The emanation of invincibility. The emanations of invincibility. The emanation of invincibility. The converger of invincibility. The convergers of invincibility. The converger of invincibility. The convergence of invincibility. The convergences of invincibility. The convergence of invincibility. The aura of invincibility. The auras of invincibility. The aura of invincibility. The impression of invincibility. The impressions of invincibility. The impression of invincibility. The intelligence of invincibility. The intelligences of invincibility. The intelligence of invincibility. The sophistication of invincibility. The sophistications of invincibility. The sophistication of invincibility. The genius of invincibility. The geniuses of invincibility. The genius of invincibility. The polymath of invincibility. The polymaths of invincibility. The polymath of invincibility. The psychic of invincibility. The psychics of invincibility. The psychic of invincibility. The knowledge of invincibility. The knowledges of invincibility. The knowledge of invincibility. The understanding of invincibility. The understandings of invincibility. The understanding of invincibility. The wisdom of invincibility. The wisdoms of invincibility. The wisdom of invincibility. The secret of invincibility. The secrets of invincibility. The secret of invincibility. The mystery of invincibility. The mysteries of invincibility. The mystery of invincibility. The revelation of invincibility. The revelations of invincibility. The revelation of invincibility. The tactic of invincibility. The tactics of invincibility. The tactic of invincibility. The strategy of invincibility. The strategies of invincibility. The strategy of invincibility. The strength of invincibility. The strengths of invincibility. The strength of invincibility. The might of invincibility. The mights of invincibility. The might of invincibility. The power of invincibility. The powers of invincibility. The power of invincibility. The authority of invincibility. The authorities of invincibility. The authority of invincibility. The dominion of invincibility. The dominions of invincibility. The dominion of invincibility. The rhythm of invincibility. The rhythms of invincibility. The rhythm of invincibility. The melody of invincibility. The melodies of invincibility. The melody of invincibility. The music of invincibility. The musics of invincibility. The music of invincibility. The lyric of invincibility. The lyrics of invincibility. The lyric of invincibility. The song of invincibility. The songs of invincibility. The song of invincibility. The dance of invincibility. The dances of invincibility. The dance of invincibility. The spirit of invincibility. The spirits of invincibility. The spirit of invincibility. The soul of invincibility. The souls of invincibility. The soul of invincibility. The body of invincibility. The bodies of invincibility. The body of invincibility. The mark of invincibility. The marks of invincibility. The mark of invincibility. The promise of invincibility. The promises of invincibility. The promise of invincibility. The visionary of invincibility. The visionaries of invincibility. The visionary of invincibility. The vision of invincibility. The visions of invincibility. The vision of invincibility. The picture of invincibility. The pictures of invincibility. The picture of invincibility. The sound of invincibility. The sounds of invincibility. The sound of invincibility. The dung of invincibility. The dungs of invincibility. The dung of invincibility. The language of invincibility. The languages of invincibility. The language of invincibility. The communication of invincibility. The communications of invincibility. The communication of invincibility. The people of invincibility. The peoples of invincibility. The people of invincibility. The society of invincibility. The societies of invincibility. The society of invincibility. The fortress of invincibility. The fortresses of invincibility. The fortress of invincibility. The government of invincibility. The governments of invincibility. The government of invincibility. The city of invincibility. The cities of invincibility. The city of invincibility. The nation of invincibility. The nations of invincibility. The nation of invincibility. The civilization of invincibility. The civilizations of invincibility. The civilization of invincibility. The world of invincibility. The worlds of invincibility. The world of invincibility.